Marc Berenson is a senior lecturer with King's Russia Institute from King's College London, and he joins us now from Brighton. Thanks ever so much for coming on the programme. I mean, just listening to our correspondent there, this censoring of social media, I mean, is there a precedent for this? What do you think it means?
This is the most restrictive suppression of the outside media that I think Russia has had for 30 years. And even during the Soviet period, many foreign newspapers and foreign news outlets still had access to Russia and covered Russia from Moscow. This is quite a different kettle of fish.
And in terms of what this means for prospect for a negotiated peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, is there still hope, or what's your take?
Well, I think the two sides are very far apart here. We're talking about, on the Ukraine side, Ukrainians very much want to maintain hold over their own land and don't want a foreign-imposed government being placed upon them. And on the other end, we have sort of the demands that are coming out of Moscow and coming out of the Kremlin are, quite frankly, extremely restrictive, calling for a new government in Kiev, or a government in Kiev that will be subject to the whims of Moscow, as well as recognizing Crimea and other parts of Ukraine that Russia's already annexed and taken control over as being part of Russia itself. These are demands that Ukrainians have said they will not stand for. So because the two sides are so far apart, this likely is going to be a protracted conflict that will go on for quite a while. On the one hand, you have the Russian forces that are very well equipped in terms of military technology and weapons, and certainly have a lot of forces. On the other hand, you have the morale of the Ukrainian people who are willing to fight to the death to preserve their homeland. And in the long run, things like sanctions from the West, things like news getting infiltrated into to Russia itself are going to have an impact, but it's unlikely to lead to an impact immediately in ending the conflict, because quite frankly, it appears as if the conflict is being driven by Putin himself at the top of the system, and he surrounded himself with people that he trusts. He's not around people who would think differently from him or would stand up to him.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's people who he trusts who won't necessarily stand up to him. And look, you talked about the long run. What will the potential impact of sanctions and isolation from the West be for Russia?
I think it's a very scary prospect. Certainly, Russia is going to be held to these sanctions, and Western corporate organizations are going to have already started to pull out. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to go back into the country and invest and provide other types of funding that Russia certainly needs to develop and to further modernize. Russia depends upon technology from the West. Being closed to that, and at the same time having oil and gas not being bought by a good portion of the world, will mean that Russia will be sort of left out in earning money over the next decade or so. At the end of that decade, roughly 10 to 12 years from now, we're going to see a different energy system in the world, in which green energies are going to be replacing fossil fuels. And what will Russia have to offer at that point? It's a very scary prospect of having an impoverished country the size of Russia with the weapons that is retained from the Soviet era, and being perhaps aggrieved just similarly to the way Putin was aggrieved when the Soviet empire collapsed in the beginning of the 1990s.
So a different energy picture and potentially a whole new world order. Marc Berenson, thank you very much.